Arnold and Assemblymember Bob.
Welcome both. I think it's a reflection of the importance of the subjects that we're covering this morning. Declaration of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations, item 2, and as ever to declare any other disclosable pecuniary and relevant interests, if I could. Thank you very much. Item 3. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held the 15th of May to be signed by me as a correct record. Item 4. Can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous committee meetings. Thank you, colleagues, for that. We now head to the main item of business this morning, which is our monthly question and answer session. I know, Martin, I know that you have a busy day today and want to leave 12, and we should do our level best to get around the building around that particular time. Oh, we have some noise. Great. Okay, so the main item that I want to talk about, and colleagues do also again, is violent crime, which remains the number one issue in London, without a shadow of a doubt. I wanted also now to ask some questions of the Assistant Commissioner, but I think before we go into that main substantive subject, I think we have one item of update that, Len, I think I wanted to take this right at the beginning, just to get that done so I can get into the main item.
Could you just very quickly apprise us of where the management team at the Met are on the future of your airwave operations? We know it's a national programme. All sorts of things are in the media about this in terms of that. It doesn't appear to be a Plan B, but Plan B means you continue paying extra costs as the system constantly falls behind the programme. What conversations and discussions have you been having, and what are you trying to do to influence this national programme to get back on track?
So we have, as you would imagine, quite a lot of conversation and discussion in relation to that. As you point out, the programme, which is run through the Home Office, is considerably delayed and is in the process of a very significant review. They've had a change of the senior team within the programme, and certainly since the new, not so new now, but the permanent SEC came in, and he's focused very clearly on a thorough review of where that programme is. There is a national Police Chiefs Council group that works directly with the programme, and our Chief Information Officer, Angus McCallum, sits on that group and is a very influential member of that group. We also influence through Chief Constables Council, which we are all present at. You'll be aware that obviously Motorola are very heavily in the middle of that, and both the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner have met with senior people within that organisation. So we are influencing, and we obviously have our plans about how we will deal. We don't yet know the exact detail of what the replanned timetable looks like. That will emerge, and I don't, off the top of my head, and I wasn't anticipating the question, so I don't know exactly when that is, but that's relatively soon. And once we have that, then obviously we will then be able to take a position both as the Met, but we are clearly a key player in this process, along with all the other forces. And there remain some significant issues that we need answering, and equally significant issues about what the capability of the system will be. Because certainly from our perspective, it is an absolutely fundamental system to us being able to do what we do. So we are heavily engaged. We are heavily engaged with the Home Office. We use every opportunity to influence. And as I say, we're just awaiting the revised programme and then to understand what the implications of that are.
Thank you.
And we'll return to that at another time. So, back on violent crime. The latest figures, year-on-year figures that we have, is a substantial increase, but also increases in what I call volume crime, robbery, theft and burglary. Now, last month we had Assistant Commissioner Helen Ball here, which is good, and we were told that the increase in violent crime was showing signs of stabilising. Not a sort of phrase I completely understand, but could you just sort of clarify your take on the latest situation?
Let me perhaps just explain, I think, what Helen was saying when she used the term stabilising. As we are all aware, at the sort of early part of last year, there was a very significant increase which at that stage led to the beginning of Operation Sceptre, which ultimately now has kind of morphed into the Violent Crime Task Force. And since that point, at sort of the middle part of last year, we then started the significant operational work and all the other work that goes around it to try and reduce that. And I think we have got it to a place where, whilst there is, if you go this year compared to the same period last year, there is a very tiny increase in terms of the numbers of knife injuries for under 25s that's not domestic. What we have done is plateaued out the level of what was a very significant increase. But there are some figures which I think are just worth mentioning around where we are. If we take the May figure, for example, for the offence of knife crime injury for under 24s, the figure in May of this year was 181 offences for that period. But if you go back to the same May in 2016, it was in fact 191 in that month. And I think
2 years.
Yeah, for 2 years ago it was 191. And if you take so if we took an average offences per day, again, if you take knife injury for under 24s, in May of this year, the average per day was 5.8 offences. In May of 18, it had been 6.2 in April of 18, and it had been 6 in March of 18. So fairly stable figures. But again, if I go back and compare that to 2016, in fact, in May 2016, it was 6.2 offences was the average in that month, so just slightly higher. And then it was 4.5 and 4.6. So I think the point I'm trying to make, there has been an increase, and it is a very worrying increase, and I don't seek in any way to underplay. But when you actually look at the figures, and we use the knife crime injury to under 24s, not in a domestic setting, as the kind of proxy figure for the knife violence. And there we are, compared to the last year, we are just slightly over on that figure, because arguably because of all the sort of suppressive activity that we've been putting into that.
Homicide figures now are...
The homicide figure, and I think the homicide figure, so the homicide figure for where we are now, let me get to the right page for that one. Obviously saw a significant increase over last year, and that was really the 2017 ending with 134 homicides, and a significant increase in the knife-related crimes. And I think that was what really sparked a lot of the media attention that is around. And of course what we're seeing now is very significant media attention around the incidents. And the homicide figure is very concerning. And where we stand at the moment, to date in 2018 there have been a total of 72 homicides. 9 of those as a result of a firearm, 47 as a result of a knife, and then 16 others. But April and May's figures are lower than the previous month, so there's been a reduction there, and in June so far the figure is low as well. But we've got to understand, and the homicide is an important figure. It clearly is a very important figure, but the key point for us is particularly those offences of the stabbing offences, because as we all know, the difference between a stabbing and a homicide is often purely, it's just luck in terms of where the weapon obviously injures the person, and then a whole range of what goes on after there. So what I'm saying is there's been an enormous amount of effort put in and I think we have stabilised the rise. It is still too high, and so I don't want any suggestion that I'm not saying that it's still too high. But we are reaching a point, I think, with the range of activities that no doubt we'll come on and talk about, that I think have stabilised that figure.
Well, we're going to be exploring the task force
of course.
with other questions, and we will delve into more figures away from this meeting to bring back another time that are more up to date, because we can quote figures clearly, and I understand that but behind every figure is a tragic
Absolutely right.
case. So it's right to discuss figures, and I think there is a place for that, but we need to understand what's particularly behind.
And I think one of the things that always concerns me is what you can obviously choose different sets of figures over different time periods with slightly different criterion, and that I think can sometimes lead to some confusion because people will use different sets of figures in different places. The simple fact of the matter is there is far too much violence, there is far too much knife violence, and there are far too many people who are dying as a result of that violence, and that's why we're putting all the effort and all the work in that we are.
But I'm going to return in a minute to volume crime, but Len, do you want to come on specifically on...
Just very quickly, in that breakdown of the homicides, how many of those were domestics?
I haven't got that figure here. There have been, certainly from my knowledge of seeing them, obviously I see every one that happens, there have been a number that have been domestic homicides, quite clearly. But that's why when we talk about the knife crime figure, the under 25, we specifically talk about non-domestic.
Could you supply that to us?
Of course we can, yeah, no, absolutely. I'll give you a full breakdown.
And then secondly, in terms of, it's quite interesting, the over 25s, but, the under 25s, so the proportion of over 25s in that homicide rate is what?
Again, off the top of my head, I don't have the sheet with all the ages.
I did see a sheet, I think when we were at 50 rather than 70, and I was surprised by the number of over, I put an arbitrary figure of over 26, I think, of that. Is that, from your knowledge, is that a surprise to you?
No, it's not a surprise.
It's not. So the over, for that, that's not a surprise and an issue?
No. And just on that point, last month when we held our crime fighters meeting, which is where I kind of hold to account, and one of the issues we were talking about quite clearly was the violence, and what I asked therefore was I want some work done, because we have focused, and I think for good reason focused as the proxy measure on the under 25 non-domestics, but we were starting to see a creeping of people in their late 20s, 30s and even into their 40s, and you will have all seen the charge for the murder just recently, which was a 42-year-old victim. So I just want some data and some analysis on that and what we think is causing that. And
just before we move on then, so have we now done an analysis of the 70? So your senior officer in charge of Trident, when he was talking about one statement I think we had very early last year of that on knife crime he thought it was 5%. He re-advised that figure to say it was 20% before, I think, the real peak of 50 plus. I saw a statement from him saying that he thought knife crime activities involving gangs, I think he's gangs, and presumably gang/county lines, was around 20%. What analysis has been done of the homicides of what's the percentage figure? Would you revise that upwards, or would you still keep it at 20%? Would you stand by his statement at 20%, or do you think it's crept upwards?
No, I would stand by that statement. I mean, I don't, I would stand by that. And I think, again, where that takes you, though, is into the territory about the definition of gang as opposed to a group that are involved in county lines, which may not necessarily be defined in that way. But I would say that figure sounds, from me seeing them all, that sounds about the right sort of figure. But I can
where it takes me is about the emphasis we place on, is it one aspect of this violent crime, or are we concentrating on all aspects of violent crime and driving these figures down? I don't want to concentrate on one. I think I made that clear in other meetings. I want to see an approach from the Met covering all violence that leads to harm and ultimately death. Do you know what I mean? In that sense, and I think that's in the Mayor's strategy as well. Whereas in government, I think there's an overemphasis of doing the county lines /gang issues, but they all needs tackling. Not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying that's where it takes me to. But no doubt we'll follow up on that, Chair, in the future and as well when we come back when you do further analysis. And
I would agree entirely with that position, and hence why what we describe it as is the violent crime task force. That's not categorising. I have some frustration often where people want a straight, simple answer that if you do this or it's all about that. And the reality of this is that's not the case. There are a number of factors and a number of dynamics that are leading to a bunch of people, generally young people, generally young men, being violent, and we need to be trying to attack that from all the angles that we can, not just us, but in all the work that we're doing through the strategy and with all the other partners that can assist. Because, and I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again, you know, there is not a police answer to all of the issues. There's an enormously important role that we have to play, and we have to do it well. But we are, you know, we're not singularly the answer to the issue.
Thank you.
I'll ask some question about volume crime, then you want to come in, Tony, I know. So my second part of my questions was, we've also seen an increase in robbery, theft and burglary, quite substantial increases to April 18, 30, 20 and 11 respectively. And we know a lot of concentration, a lot of work and resources going into the subjects we just talked about. But could you comment on the increases on those? Is that because there's a connection with the violent crime, or is that a case of resources taking an eye off that particular crime? Do you want to comment, Martin?
Yeah, of course. I don't think there's any sense of taking an eye off, but there is a realism about we have to manage and use our resources to deal with those things that are priorities. Certainly around burglary, I think burglary, and particularly domestic burglary, is a separate type of offending. I don't think it fits particularly with the violent crime that we're talking about, and there is a lot of emphasis around domestic burglary, and that is in some boroughs it's more of an issue, and it's deemed both locally to be more of an issue than others, and there is a focus wherever across Pan London, and there's a clear burglary plan, and there is particular focus in certain areas, and that work goes on. There's been some really good work. The work that we've done around Met Trace in terms of the preventive work and the reductions that we've seen in those parts of London that we've rolled that out to so far is very encouraging. A lot of the work around burglary has to be around crime prevention activity, because there are many opportunities around that, and we're doing very well around there. And if you take a particular example up in the East area where there was a significant burglary issue, Operation Mexico, which is a Pan borough and supported by the centre, has seen dramatic reductions, and we're in the process of kind of rolling that sort of methodology out. So I think that's a separate one, but it is still very much a focus. And we're not lost to the fact that burglary is a particular concern to the public, as we all understand. I think with the theft, but certainly with the robbery, there is a crossover into the violent crime. Often robbery by definition, there'll be some sort of force or violence either used or threatened. There will be robberies where there is a knife present. There will be other robberies where a knife is intimated by the offender. And so that focus is there, and part of the activity that the Violent Crime Task Force and all the other work that's going on the BCUs will be done, will focus in on that kind of activity. And again, we've got to really work around the focus around the crime prevention side of that as well, and we've done quite a lot of work through the Be Safe campaign to try and do everything that we can do to allow people to make themselves as safe as they can.
2 points I make on that, particularly on burglary. You'll remember a while back there was quite a spike, it was very high, and we got a grip on it, and burglary was reduced. And it's a shame and a worry that it's moving up, because the point you've made, and it's been made often, is that this serious violence, tragic that it is, doesn't affect the bulk of Londoners, which I think is obviously a clear and obvious thing. But what does affect Londoners is things like burglary. So when you go out in the boroughs, and in the neighbourhoods, if there's a burglary, it has quite an impact on that neighbourhood. And I think seeing a rise in it is of a concern. So I think this is something that we will obviously return to.
And I think that's right, but I would add also that, firstly, the rises that we are seeing are considerably smaller rises than are seen pretty much everywhere else in the country. And our rises are based against those very, very significant reductions that you refer to, you know, up to a sort of tail end of 16, 17. So, again, not remotely complacent about it, and we are working really hard around burglary. But I do take the point that, as you say, the violent crime does tend to be impactive in pockets, but burglary is something that has a much more universal impact.
On the subject of the items that Len raised, we will write to you for some details around some of the...
Absolutely, yeah, no, it's absolutely fine.
Right, fantastic. Tony, you want to come?
Yes, a couple of questions to the Deputy Mayor, please. Yesterday, Deputy Mayor, the Commissioner repeated the claim that there is a link between police cuts and the increase in violent crime. Do you agree with that?
Also, I agree with that. I mean, as you said, the Commissioner was in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee yesterday and she was asked about that. And she said it would be naive not to think that there was some link between that. And the Home Office research, which backed up the violent crime strategy that was published, not the research that was published, also made that link between decreasing resources, decreasing police officers and a rise in violent crime.
Could you explain to me then, please, how you see the link between the increase in moped-assisted violent crime and police cuts? What's the connection between those two?
We know that in terms of London, in terms of the resources that the Metropolitan Police has had, they've had to take over £700 million out of their budget over the last few years. The police officer numbers have now dipped below 30,000. The Metropolitan Police they work incredibly hard, day in, day out, but they are very stretched. In terms of prioritising, there is a link. You have to see that where you cannot get enough officers onto the street because the number of officers is reduced, it does and has to have an impact on the ability to tackle crime.
I see. So I did ask you about a specific kind of violent crime, and you are suggesting that somehow or another that cuts have encouraged people to take part in moped-assisted crime. Is that right?
What I'm saying is that there are a number of reasons as to why why the crime is rising in London and, as the Assistant Commissioner says, across the country. One of those reasons is a lack of resources and the decrease in resources for the Metropolitan Police and nationally as well. There's been thousands of police officers. It is not the only reason, nor am I excusing criminality. That individuals take their own decisions, make their own choices around criminality. I'm not excusing that, but there are a number of different reasons as to why crime is rising. One of those is about resources. There's also, as we know, in terms of research and analysis of what is happening, there's the issue of opportunity,
forgive me,
drugs and gangs.
That's a generic answer. I was asking you about a specific crime which affects London, a specific kind of violent crime which affects London, and you are drawing a link between that specific crime which affects London and police cuts. Now, I don't think you have demonstrated that that's so. The general response is that on this matter, and it's the first time that a police officer has been drawn into this argument about funding, where she appears to be following, and this is why I'm asking you the question of a political line, that it is budget cuts which are fueling the rise in crime. And generally they've talked about things, and indeed I think I've heard you say it, it's related to things like cuts in the youth service and so on. Today, Mr. Hewitt has conceded to Len that around 50% of knife crime is committed by people over the age of 26. I think I heard you say that. Is that right, Mr. Hewitt?
I don't think I gave that figure in that specific.
Well, Len asked you. Len asked you about that, and he said that was a figure he'd seen, and I don't think you disagreed with him. It is right, isn't it?
You're right for some clarification.
The point I'm making, Deputy Mayor, is that those things which have related to general cuts applies to youth crime, and let's say, again, relating to the definition given by Mr. Hewitt, people under the age of 24, can't possibly apply to that 50% of people over the age of 26, that 50% of knife crime which is committed by people over the age of 26. So there is no link, is there?
Forgive me, you've put a number of different issues into what you've just said.
Indeed.
In terms of, can I just pick up on the first thing you said, that it's the first time that a police officer has talked about funding. Actually, members of the police service have been warning about the cuts and the decreasing resources for the police across the country and in London for a number of years. We've had the Commissioner, the Deputy Commissioner, previous Commissioner as well as National Police Service as well, talking about the stretch that the police service is under. This isn't the first time. There have been repeated warnings to the government that if they continue on their course of taking this substantial amount of money out of the police service, there there will be consequences. It isn't the only thing that is fueling a rise in violence or fueling a rise in crime. It is one of the factors. That is why it can be linked to other aspects, not just youth crime.
We accept that, Deputy Mayor. I mean, I've sat here and I've heard commissioners, many commissioners over the years, talk about things, but I have never before had a commissioner who has gone on record to say that it is a violent crime. I mean, this is what we are concerned with this morning, violent crime being affected by police cuts, because there's always been a priority of, in policing to deal with violent crime. Can I suggest to you, Deputy Mayor, that perhaps the real reason why violent crime is increasing on London streets is the increasing belief that the perpetrators will get away with it? Can I give you some figures which we had from the MPS earlier this week? Where a knife was used against the person between 2015 and 2017, the number of cases which police proceeded with, actually took action on, has fallen from 31% to 22%. That was 31% in 2015, police proceeded. 2016, 27%. Last year, 2017, only 22%. Now, if you are someone who's thinking about committing a crime, isn't it likely that one of the things that's likely to affect you is the chances of getting away with it?
It's, in terms of why people commit crimes and what is fueling that, there are a number of reasons. I absolutely, in terms of detection rates, and the rates have fallen because there is an increase in crime. The actual numbers, the volume is about static actually when you look at the figures. So absolutely, it must make a difference, and those that are committing those crimes absolutely need to feel that they will get caught and the full force of the law will be used against them. And that is why, in terms of violence, the Mayor has put £15 million extra into the Metropolitan Police to ensure that there is extra enforcement through the Violent Crime Task Force, through Operation Sceptre, but particularly through the Violent Crime Task Force. And over the last couple of months, as the Violent Crime Task Force is getting up to full strength, you can see that those enforcement and those arrests coming through.
That's a form of interpreting the figures in a way which makes your case, but doesn't make my case, in the sense that what is being suggested is that somehow or another affecting the amount of funds which police get affects the amount of crime which is committed. I'm drawing your attention to violent crime, where the amount of violent crime has increased. And I'd be very interested actually to see whether or not what you have said is accurate, that 22%, which is last year's figure, of the number of knife crimes against a person actually equated to 31% in 2015 being detected. The figures, I have to tell you, are even worse in relation to robbery. In 2015, 20% of cases of robbery against a person where a knife was used were proceeded against, but last year only 10% were proceeded against. Now, if you are right, and these figures are wrong, the number of people who were robbed at knife point must have more than doubled between 2015 and 2017. Would that be right, Mr. Hewitt? Has the number of robberies involving a knife doubled in 2 years?
I will try and check the figure.
You have the figure, great, Mark.
Well, I mean, if you don't have the figure,
yes.
In
the
short,
robbery.
Can we bring this to you?
Yeah, in short, Deputy Mayor, although there are a large number of interconnected reasons why crime in general is rising, in relation to violent crime, the link has been made specifically to cuts in police funding. I find that difficult to accept because we have heard from Mr. Hewitt, we've constantly heard, and we know that additional monies have been given to the MPS to deal with these particular very unpleasant crimes, and that therefore is their priority. But at the same time that monies, according to you, have been cut and have led to that increase in violent crime, there has been a failure of the MPS to actually take proceedings against the people who are committing the violent crime. And the thesis I'm putting to you is this, that the reason which is driving the increase in violent crime is the belief that they're going to get away with it.
I've already said that in terms of what is fueling the increase in violent crime, as the Commissioner also said, there are a number of factors. It is a complex situation, as we've had a discussion today about what is, the different demographics of those who are being injured as well as those who are losing their lives. There are a number of issues. One of those, and the ones that we're particularly concerned around, is about the resourcing of the Metropolitan Police. They have had to take £700 million out of their budget. That has a consequence. Police officer numbers in London are falling below 30,000, as well as police staff and substantial cuts to PCSOs as well. It does have an effect. It's not the only thing that's fueling violent crime, but it does have an effect. There are also the other cuts to service, which you've also touched upon, around what are the drivers of these crimes. Yes, of course, offenders, people that are perpetrating these crimes, must feel that they are likely to get caught, and the police absolutely have to do everything they can to ensure that happens. But we also have to make sure that
this to a head, Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, we also. I've been asked particularly around this. We also have to ensure that we tackle those the drivers of the crime, around why young people, in particular at the moment, are going towards and are becoming more violent. Well, some young people, not all young people, and that it really does. We really need to look about the funding for youth services, the funding for mental health services as well.
Well, thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Chairman. I will draw this to a halt, but I think that the significant thing which has come out of this, and as I say, it came out of the response to Assembly Member Duval's question, is in the high number of people who commit knife crime who are over the age of 25 and who ought not to be affected by those other matters.
Look, on this subject, can we just leave it there if we may? On the subject of the breakdown on ages we're going to pursue further, and also about proceeding against, or the lack of, we can investigate that further. And I'll remind members that in a month's time we do have Cressida Dick in front of us, and those that may wish to ask her to clarify those comments. Briefly, Mark? Sorry,
Chair, can I just make one point of clarification, because I do think it is important. The figure that we talked about when we talked about the numbers of knife crime for under 25s or over 25s relates to the victim. It's the victim age that is spoken about, not the suspect age, which we often will know the suspect, we may not. So it's the victim age. And if, again, I refer back to the news articles that have just been with the murder that happened in West London, where the victim was 42 years old, and as you will see from the newspapers, we've just charged a 14-year-old with that offence. So I think we just need to be careful that our figures are accurate.
I understand that point.
Right, good. So, getting back on the track that I have, we talked about the Violent Crime Task Force earlier, and about the sustainability. Andrew, you're going to ask some questions.
Yes, if I could. Just one question on what Tony's been talking about. Is one of the issues in relation to the fall of sanction detection rate the shortage of detectives? I think we're about 750 short. And the other point I was going to make was, if there are fewer officers on the street, the deterrent effect, for example, of the likelihood of getting stopped and searched is lower. And again, that can contribute through fewer officers. Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yeah, I think yes to both, in fact. I mean, no doubt we may touch on stop and search, but yes to the presence of officers. And then also in terms of the detective, I've spoken several times in front of you in relation to what is, again, not a single issue. So we do have a limited number or a gap in detectives. As you are well aware, we're doing lots of things to try and fill that gap. But it's compounded by, we then equally have other demands that are drawing on our detective resource. So the growth in counter-terrorism policing draws on our detectives, the people investigating the Grenfell Tower fire draws on our detectives, and so on. So I think you're absolutely right. It has to have an impact on the detection rate across the piece.
Okay, anyway, can I go on to the subject I really want to talk about, which is tackling violent crime. To start off with, I think the target is 158 officers in the task force by July. How many officers and staff have you got on it at the moment?
So at the moment there are 45 more to come, police officers, who will be the second half of the kind of core task force. Those officers have now been selected. As I said to you, I think previously in the closed session that we had during PERDA, rather than just nominate and allocate, we wanted to, because this is going to be something that is going to last for some time, we wanted officers. We had over 500 officers who applied or expressed an interest in wanting to be part of the task force. We've selected those officers. That will go through the process of getting them posted over the next probably 4 weeks or so, and that will be the last 45 to come in. What we are also getting additionally through the funding that the Mayor has provided is we are going to be bringing in 15 civilian investigators to assist. So as you may be aware, in a number of issues, we go out to the market to retired detectives, retired officers who have particular skills who you can bring back in. So we are also bringing in some of those officers to assist us with the investigations and doing some of the work with obviously without a warrant card to support us.
And continue the same theme. The Mayor was seen on TV attending a raid by the Violent Task Force. And most of the officers seem to be from the City of London Police, rather than the Met. I don't know if that was a trick of the camera.
No, it wasn't a trick of the camera.
Or to what extent are you relying on the City Police to support you in this?
What we're relying on the City Police to do is to, and the British Transport Police for that matter, to provide us with extra over and above what we are doing. And I have to say, both of those organisations have been fantastic in providing us with additional resource so that rather than just do the one raid on that morning that the Mayor was at, we are able to do raids across London, which is what we are doing on a daily basis. So I make no apologies for utilising the kind of cooperative work that we do regularly with both City and BTP. If you think about BTP, particularly around the big providing additional resource for us, particularly, for example, Stratford, at the terminus there at Stratford, where there are a whole range of issues, absolutely great work by BTP. So we work and use both of them. Yeah. I did smile myself when I saw that footage. But that for me is just we're using all the asset we can.
So when you call them BTP or City Police, they're not actually part of the Violent Crime Task Force?
No, they are not.
They're sort of drafted in for particular
Correct.
operations?
Both of them are really keen to be part of our process. They are... One of the things that we do, as I've said before, we have this pod in the Special Operations Room that is there 24 hours a day running all the activity around violence. That has a 10:30 in the morning call where everybody is coming in and we're looking at what we need to be doing, and both BTP and City of London are part of that process every day.
Okay. And the next question is, to what extent are you relying on abstractions to fill in the gaps on the Violent Crime Task Force, in particular dedicated ward officers? Because I've had reports in Camden of dedicated ward officers being taken off their dedicated role to support knife crime initiatives in Islington and Camden.
Well, it should be very rare for a dedicated ward officer to be taken off their ward to support them. Now, clearly, if activity is happening on their ward, then that's absolutely fine, I would say, to use them. But the number of abstractions is one of the key things that the Deputy Mayor holds us to account around and is obviously measured locally. So that should not be happening. Are we bolstering the Violent Crime Task Force activity with local officers? Of course we are, to try and as you are aware, every borough, so the BCUs, but individually every borough has a plan of all the activity that they will be doing to counter the violent crime. And then the task force fits into that plan. So it's not simply what the task force bring, it's the force multiplier then of using the resources locally.
Well, certainly understand that if there's something particular going on in a particular ward, the DWOs would be involved in that, that's obvious. But the report I had was was that a particular ward officer, for example, had 2 shifts disrupted over the previous 2 weeks when he'd been taken off to do knife crime elsewhere. I think that's now stopped in Camden because I raised it at the time.
I hope so. That should not be what's happening. If that was what happened, it should not have been happening.
Yeah, okay. And the next point I wanted to ask was about cancelled rest days and to what extent that's impacting and to what extent you're relying on cancelled rest days for supporting this work. And according to the BBC at the weekend, there were 189,000 rest days cancelled last year. I presume that's not all for violent crime, but for other things as well. But that, by my reckoning, if you've got 30,000 officers, and obviously they're not all affected the same way, that's at least 6 days a year on average, which is an awful lot, and presumably some a lot more than that.
If so, it is not an even. There will be times where we have to cancel people's rest days. There are times where you will cancel them in advance and it's all planned through and you will re-roster those rest days. There are times where it has to be done at short notice. 2017 was an extraordinary year. If you think of the 3 terrorist incidents and the fire, and then you add in all the other things that happen, and when you get a rise in violent crime, you then get obviously crime scenes to deal with, and crime scenes are often complex and multi-sited, and they all need to be guarded for the period of investigation. So it was a relatively extraordinary year. We monitor how many rest days we are cancelling. Sometimes that is unavoidable, and if you go into certain specialist units where you've got fewer people with the skills, it can be quite a challenge. But then it's about the local leadership teams really monitoring and driving down in terms of making people get those rest days re-rostered. But I would be lying if I said we're not under pressure, because we have been under pressure now for a considerable period with just the sheer tempo of operational activity that is required. But to suggest that the work that the task force are doing is reliant on cancelled rest days is not true. And again, I know there's been stories around loads of leave being cancelled, which again that would be a very extraordinary thing if there are times where we need to do it because of the job we do, but it's not a routine thing.
Okay, so that's not going to be the new normal?
No, it certainly is not, no. And it's something that we bear down on repeatedly.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I suppose it's a reflection again of the previous discussion about not having enough officers to go around.
Yeah.
How are those who lose the rest days compensated? Do they get the rest days back another time, or do they get overtime pay for it?
Yeah, well, you get I mean, the ideal is what you do is you re-roster the rest day. You re-roster. Sometimes there will be pay for a rest day that's cancelled, but we normally will do it in the process so that we're giving enough notice, because if we give sufficient notice, you re-roster the rest day. If you're unable to give sufficient notice, then the officer will get the option.
So, can we have the figures for rest day cancellations up to up to the end of the
Yeah, I mean, if you
I mean, not, obviously you don't have them now, but
no, fair enough. That's not one.
I think
that's
that
in
would
my
be
head.
interesting to try and do a comparison.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine.
You know, I am concerned that we're seeing officers effectively being drafted in all over the place to plug gaps.
Yeah, they're not, and again, it's the immediate cancellation will happen where you've got something that spontaneously occurs. The majority of what we're doing around the task force, and this is the whole point of having that pod in the special operations room, is that we are planning. This is being planned on the boroughs, it's being planned centrally, and there's coordination about the activity we use, how we use the violent crime task force, how we use the additional police support units that we may come on to talk about that we are deploying as well. The whole, and this is true of policing always, you are attempting to constantly anticipate and plan obviously the resource time, because our people need to get time off. Our people need to be able to go and kind of defuse from what they're doing at work, and it is not sensible for us to be just burning people out.
Caroline, you want to come in?
I just wanted to understand, because the task force is funded by £15 million that the Mayor has put into it, and you're talking about a really stretched service, having to do paying for lots of overtime, because some of this team you've pulled out, you're then going to backfill those posts. Yeah. You've got only 15 civilian investigators you pulled in. Yeah, all I want to understand, and ask Deputy Mayor, you've recently approved a decision to transfer 9.9 million police officer pay underspend to reserves. So in this, in the financial year 2017-18, 27 million you transferred to reserves. How are you able to do that when it sounds to me like everything is so stretched, yet you've managed to effectively stash away 27 million? It doesn't quite add up.
That transfer of the underspend on police officer pay is because police officer numbers have had to fall because of the projection, not just because of the projections, but because of the cuts to police grant from the government. We are having to manage the budget to bring police officer numbers down, because we are still having to take savings out of the budget. We've found about half of those savings, but we know the other half is going to be, unless the government comes up with more money, we think that that will have to be about police officers. What we're doing is managing that decline, because you could, you know, we don't want to just fall off a cliff edge. So in terms of the underspend, that has been put into reserves to try to ensure that we can keep officer numbers up to a certain level in years ahead as well. I'm not talking years and years, but in the next couple of years. So we're trying to manage it so we don't suddenly get a massive drop in police officers, which will be incredibly difficult for the Metropolitan Police to manage and will have all sorts of effects. So in terms of that underspend, it is there to try to ensure that we can keep police officer numbers up in the coming years.
Okay, but the 15 million provided by the budget is by the Mayor to fund this is really just money, you're just reallocating money you already have.
No, it's not a reallocation of money. That 15 million has come out of the Mayor put into the Metropolitan Police in this year's budget of £110 million. That has come from the increase in the police precept, but it has also come from the business rates as well. So that is additional money that is going in, and that 15 million is not coming from police officer underspend. It is coming from that additional money that was part of the budget that the Mayor set in February.
Okay, and where does the overtime come from? Is that a separate budget?
Well, there's a separate budget for overtime, in general overtime for the Metropolitan Police. Some of the backfilling of the posts and any overtime that's needed because of anybody going into the Violent Crime Task Force is being paid for out of that 15 million, but it's not paid for other elements of overtime within the Metropolitan Police.
Presumably your overtime budget is through the roof this year.
There was an overspend. There was an overspend last year, slight overspend in the overtime budget. Again, it's all about planning, so that we're planning the use of overtime. The one that hits you is obviously the spontaneous overtime. So planned overtime would be, for example, we know how many bank holidays are going to be in any year. We know we've got big events. So coming on Saturday, when you've got, we'll plan for things like the birthday parade without having to use much overtime. But you're going to get the spontaneous stuff. The 15 million, so we have an overtime budget built in, and each department will have an overtime budget that it would be working to for that year, and that is pretty strictly managed. The £15 million, part of that £15 million will be used to provide overtime where we need overtime, specifically around the activity in and around the Violent Crime Task Force.
Are you having to use some of the 15 million to pay the other police forces who are doing operations for you?
If there was overtime involved in that, we probably would. I don't know for definite, but we probably would. But we're not paying for the time. So when the City of London come and assist, or the British Transport Police, that is part of the arrangements that we have all the time, working with one another, because we will assist them likewise. So it's really part of the working, because it's a London issue, and they're, as I say, they're playing a very key part in it with us.
While we're on finance, for the sake of balance, Deputy Mayor, no doubt you'll welcome the special grant award yesterday by a government of 10.5 million for Grenfell costs and 7.8 million for terrorism costs, which the Assembly had played a large part of.
Well, absolutely welcome being paid back the money that's had to be spent on those particular incidents, absolutely, yeah. But I would expect it as well, yeah. not to be ungrateful.
Thank you very much. I thought for the sake of balance it's worth mentioning, and again I'll reiterate that I think the Assembly itself had a say in that, because we passed a motion last year, because I believe the Met actually were not in receipt of that grant.
We obviously did. I mean, I can't speak specifically for the CT because that's not my area, but certainly with Grenfell we did, and perhaps I can use the opportunity to say that there will be ongoing Grenfell costs, and we will be seeking those, so the Assembly's help again would be very welcome, because this is going to be a lengthy and costly operation.
Be assured the Assembly and this committee will be supportive.
Thank you.
Okay.
Just on that, I mean, in terms of what you as a committee might be able to do as well, is that it is welcome that we're being reimbursed for this cost, but there is still the issue around the threshold for special grant, and the fact that the Met's 1%. Budget is so large, you have to get 1%. Now the government has waived it for these incidents.
That still stands. That threshold still stands,
and that's still a problem.
Yeah.
And it'd be really good if you might be able to lobby on that as well.
I will consult Leeds, but I'm sure that we will be sympathetic to that, Deputy Mayor. Thank you. Right, moving on. Previously we had in front of us Kevin Southworth. And he linked the relationship between drugs and serious violence. And we've got a set of questions around that. Andrew, welcome. Would you like to proceed?
Assistant Commissioner, we heard that many youngsters who carry a knife may well also be carrying a drug stash, often cannabis. What attention is the Met giving to street dealing as a way of tackling violent crime?
So there is always attention given to street dealing. If I'm honest, I think we probably need to put more emphasis in that, and that was a debate that we as a management board have had very recently. And literally so we pushed that, and as I was coming in here this morning, I got the update because on that very issue there's been a series of search warrants undertaken this morning in Tower Hamlets, where we've searched 30 addresses and arrested 27 people, drugs seized, weapons seized, including a taser, and £20,000 worth of cash. So there is that activity going. There is no doubt that there is a link between drugs trade and the drugs activity and the violence that is undertaken. Some of that violence is about enforcing your particular drug market or your drug territory. Some of that will be between individual groups. It's not the only cause, but it is a substantial cause. It's the drug market, and I'm sure that Kevin Southworth will have talked quite a bit about the county lines phenomenon. One of the factors around county lines that I think is the most disturbing is that what it's doing is drawing younger and younger children into that criminality, and by the fact that they are in that criminality, they are then, this becomes a norm in terms of the way you behave. They are witnessing and experiencing violence as well as the drugs criminality. It's very hard for them to exit that, and so that is a real concern, and that's why there's so much effort in and around the county lines. And much of that effort is about seeing those children as victims, the kind that you talk about, where you're 12, 13, 14 and you're couriering drugs from one part of London to either another part of London or elsewhere. And you will have seen that we have actually now had a successful conviction for human trafficking in terms against the drug group with the children who were carrying the drugs as the victims. So there is a direct link. We have always focused on all the aspects of street dealing. I think what you will see is a much greater focus on that as we move forward. And as I say, that example that literally I found out about coming here this morning is a good example of that.
You've come to that conclusion through evidence that's been made available to you with regard to the linkages between drugs. I'd be grateful if at some point you could share some of that evidence, because at the moment it's just testimony that we've heard people associating the two, but it would be great to see.
And I think we can share some of that, and we've done quite comprehensive work. But it is understanding the complexity and the kind of nuances of it. There's not a simple causal line, but there is no doubt there is a significant link.
So do you anticipate that action against treating the street dealing will that be a high priority for you? Is it going to be a high priority?
It's a priority, because what also comes around the street dealing is some of the robbery that you will see is in and around the sort of environment of the street dealing for obvious reasons. But it's part of you have to have a layered approach to dealing with.
Forgive me, I just want some idea of how much of a priority, because I think everything the police is responsible for you could describe as a priority.
That's part of our challenge. Yeah.
Yes, it is your challenge, and it was ever thus. How high a priority is dealing with the street dealing?
Well, I think what I would say is dealing with drugs as a criminality in its own right and a driver for crime, and particularly the violent crime, is a high priority. We are linking the dealing with violence and dealing with drugs together, and it's about looking at it. And I know you've focused on the street dealing, and of course there's there's a responsibility around that, and some of that work will be being done by what the task force are doing and what's done locally within plans. But it is also about dealing with the next level up, the sort of county lines particularly, and the groups that are organising. And then we also have resource that's dealing with the really top end around the sort of importation and the distribution there. And I think you do have to look at this. You do have to look at this end to end.
Been made aware from plenty of testimony that, you know, perhaps some of the people who may be responsible for this are the people who are creating the demand for drugs. Is that? Do you think?
Just explain that.
Well, the people who require cannabis, for example.
Oh, I see what you mean.
The trade itself is creating the problem. Is that something you're sympathetic to?
Problem, i.e. the drug dealing.
Of drug dealing and the concomitant.
Well, I think that's fairly straightforward kind of supply and demand, isn't there? Yes. If there is a supply, someone or a demand, someone will supply it, and I think that's a reality, isn't it?
And when I quizzed the Commissioner back on the 21st of December, I asked her, I said, Commissioner, is the possession of cannabis a high priority crime for you? And she said, it is not the highest priority crime, but it is a crime and it is something that we enforce the law in relation to. How can the implications of that trade, i.e. the street dealing, be a high priority if the enforcement of possession of cannabis isn't a high priority? How do the two marry up?
As you just said yourself, everything can't be a high priority, and what we have to work on is looking at things from a threat, harm, and risk perspective. If the option for me is for my officers to deal with somebody who is carrying a knife, who is potentially going to assault somebody, who is going to go and ride around on a scooter and commit criminality, then I would regard that as a higher priority to deal with those individuals than someone who is in possession of cannabis.
I get that, but how successful will your policy be in tackling street dealing as a high priority if the demand is not a high priority? In the long term, what's going to happen?
Well, we can only focus on those things that present the greatest threat, harm and risk. And the greatest threat at the moment, without any doubt, is the violent crime that is happening in certain communities and is blighting certain communities. And that is what I want our people to focus on. Possession of cannabis is a criminal offence, quite clearly, and we will deal with that. But I don't want officers diverted spending lots of time dealing with that, which I suspect is what the Commissioner was saying, when we have to deal with the whole range of other priorities. We are constantly having to make a decision around those things which we prioritise.
You're effectively saying you're not going to be able to stop the demand. All you can deal with is the symptoms of that demand.
Well, we have to deal with, as you described, the symptoms of the demand. But I don't think it's realistic to think that were we to suddenly do a great purge on possession of cannabis, that would stop the demand per se.
Neither do I. I'm just trying to understand how this is a joined-up policy with regard to cannabis itself. I realise you have a difficult position. Perhaps I can ask
the point I just want to make, it is a joined-up policy, but there are resource realities that we have to deal with. Do I want them to be dealing with the people that are carrying knives or the people that are putting 12-year-old children onto trains carrying cocaine? Yes, that's where I want us to focus, because the risk and the harm and the threat there is very significant. Do we deal with all criminality? Of course we do. But we can only do that within the resources that we have, and we have to prioritise.
If there were no demand, those young people wouldn't be at risk.
But I come back to say, I think, well, first of all, the demand from county lines is not necessarily cannabis. And secondly, I think it's naive to think that purely by us focusing on that would reduce or would eradicate the demand. It's a demand that's been present for some time.
Right. If I could ask the Deputy Mayor, therefore, what are the Mayor and MOPAC doing to prevent drug use and the demand for drugs in the capital?
We pay for over £500,000 is for the Metropolitan Police to do the drug testing in custody for those offenders that are coming in and they are tested. And we also, through the London Crime Prevention Fund...
could you go back on the testing?
We,
the £500,000? I didn't hear.
We invest over £500,000 into the Metropolitan Police to do the drug testing in custody for those that are coming through custody to test them. And then we, through the London Crime Prevention Fund, we have the drug intervention programme, which is the referral process for those that are tested positive to get them into treatment. We don't fund the treatment. That is obviously a responsibility of Public Health England to fund the treatment. We fund the testing and the drug intervention programme. And at the moment, we are reviewing the drug, and we have been for a few months, reviewing the drug intervention programme to see how effective it is, to see the value for money, and to see whether we ought to be shaping it in a different way. We hope to have the outcome of that review before the summer, an interim outcome of that review, so that we can actually look at what we should, whether we need to change the type of services that we are commissioning.
How will that, what you've just told me, address the demand for drugs in the capital?
Well, it's predicated on trying to deal with treatment, isn't it, and trying to ensure that where there is where people need treatment, that they can access their treatment. And the drug intervention programme is about supporting those that are being referred into treatment and helping them and supporting them into that treatment. Obviously, the NHS Public Health England is commissioning the treatment services. It's about treatment.
Yeah, I understand you're talking about treatment,
yeah.
Which is fine.
Mm-hmm.
But there's plenty of people in London today who've been using drugs for years and require no treatment. It's a fact. It's not a value judgment. It's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
So unless they want to be treated for something, apart from those, what are we doing to reduce the demand?
That is part of that. In terms of what MOPAC is doing in reducing demand, it is around ensuring that it's not just those who are asking for treatment. There are drug protection prevention orders where part of their sentencing is around drug treatment, and that we are making sure that through the drug intervention programme that they are able to access that treatment and supporting them through that. You asked me specifically about what MOPAC is doing.
You're aware of the figures of how many people take illegal drugs in London. It's a figure that can rise as high as 20% or down even only 5%. But the independent reviews are showing that there are plenty of people in London at the moment taking drugs. What are you doing to prevent them from doing so? And
you asked me the same question, and my answer is around what we are doing is we are investing in drug intervention programmes. I mean, there are a number of other things that happen around trying to deal with demand, isn't there? Around education through schools, around drugs and drugs education. What we're doing at the moment is investing in the drug intervention programme, but there are a number of other things around making sure that there is proper education through PSHE around the dangers of drugs and what in terms of drug taking. That's also around demand management.
What is the Mayor and MOPAC doing with regard to that, to preventing the use of it? You're describing these events.
I'm not describing anything. I'm telling you what we are investing in. We are investing in the drug intervention programme at the moment. Over £5 million through the London Crime Prevention Fund on that. Over £500,000 into custody around testing for drugs. That is what MOPAC is doing in terms of our responsibilities.
Not a great deal of preventative stuff there, though, is there, in terms of use?
I have to move this on.
Yes, I will move it on. I'll be very quick.
Conclusion.
Do you think that there needs to? How are you in your approach on drugs? How are you liaising with the Mayor's health team, and how are you feeding into the health inequality strategy?
So in terms of, it's really, as Martin has also described, in terms of our work around violence reduction, it's a part of that public health approach. We have a public health work underway on public health approach and working with the Mayor's health advisor and working with the Mayor's health team around what are the drivers of violence. Now, drugs and the drugs market are clearly a driver of that violence. We are, as I've already said, investing in the drug intervention programme. As part of the public health approach, we will also be looking at what else needs to be done around some of the demand issues that you're talking about. I think, and I don't know whether this is what you're trying to get at, there are certainly issues around number of individuals in London who think that they can buy Class A drugs and it have no effect whatsoever on communities. It's just their individual choice. It's not. The drugs market is fueling not all the violence in London. It is, as we've already discussed, it is complex. It's not just about the drugs market, but it's, you know, a significant proportion. It is fueling violence, and people need to understand that when they think they are buying a Class A drug for their recreational use, there are no victims. There are victims. They're in London.
That's an important point that I think we need to draw out. Finally, Andrew.
So just to let you know, I mean, in the entire Mayor's health strategy, draft health strategy, drugs is only mentioned once in any of the policies as an add-on, it was sort of an afterthought to tobacco and alcohol. Don't you think that it needs some specific mention by the Mayor about preventing drugs use?
It is in there, and it's certainly in terms of the work that we are doing and what are the drivers of crime. We know that the drugs market, which is clearly, it is about those that are dealing, but it's also about the demand, as Martin's talked about supply and demand, that we do need to look at that demand and bear down on that demand. Now, that is through treatment, but it's not just through treatment.
So which is your priority, a reduction in harm or a reduction in use?
In terms of this discussion today around violence, the priority is absolutely reducing violence. That is what is really affecting Londoners at the moment. And it's, you know,
a reduction in harm or a reduction in use of drugs?
Our priority is driving down violence. And if that means that we have to actually also drive down drug markets, that is that's what the Metropolitan Police are doing and focusing on as well.
Would you say your priority is a reduction in harm?
It's a reduction in the violence that is taking place on the streets of London at the moment.
That's
and yet, in terms of
so incidental to that is the use
policy has always
of
been
drugs.
around harm, hasn't it? Around drug use and drug taking. That harm reduction has been a policy driver for quite a number of years. We are looking and not looking. We are investing in drug treatment. The police are driving down the drug markets and
I would suggest that you do talk to the health team, because their priority
is
the health. Their priority is the reduction in use, not the reduction in harm.
Okay.
We are already.
Anyway,
it's not. I don't need to be suggested to talk to the health team. We are discussing.
You've explored that as far as you wish to, Andrew. Right, for the moment. And thank you for answering those questions. Clearly, the connection on this with drugs and violence, but that's worth exploring. I would remind members we're into the second hour of AC Hewitt, so I'd like everyone to pick up a bit of pace. But I just see Jeanette. Do you still want to proceed, Jeanette?
Yes, Chair. No, I just wanted to seek some clarity from the Assistant Commissioner. And I take absolutely what you're saying about there being, a chain with the supply, the demand and the possession. Yeah. But I just want to know, what do you say to those communities, like the one that I represent, who have seen something like a percentage change between 2016 and 17 and 17-18 of 85% in robbery offences, and what those residents are reporting is young people on the streets selling drugs. They also then are reporting back burglary. It seems like in Islington, even if you nail it down, it's going to be stolen, because the rate is something like 30% at the moment. Now, we've heard that, there's a shortage of detectives, that the Met's number is now below 30. But what do you say to residents, like the ones that I represent and in other parts? Are you saying that they are to sit back and know that the Met is really working hard at the serious end, and what you're going to have to just live with the robbery and violence that's taking place and scarring and changing your environment?
I would never, ever say you just sit back and accept that, and I don't accept it either. We are working against all of those issues, and the robbery issue will be picked up in around the violence, working as I've suggested. The burglary figures, as I said in answer to the previous question, we will be working towards the burglary. That's where we've got to really get into some of the preventive, and I take your comment, but we've got to get into the kind of what we can do preventive and work with communities and householders and so on. But no one should be sitting back and accepting, and we're not sitting back and accepting, but there is a reality about the range of things that we are faced to deal with, and how we utilise our resource. And certainly in that area, particularly the moped-enabled criminality has been very, very significant, and you know, it pretty much emanated out of Camden and Islington, and it's spread a little further. So that's a huge priority for us in that area, and we have seen very significant reductions in those offences, and we'll continue to keep trying to do that. And then it's continuing to work around all the preventive activity that we are doing. But it is never going to be saying to people, you just have to accept this, because that's not true. And certainly in that area as well, you talk about the more serious, but lots of our central resource has been operating in that area for long periods of time because of the level of the criminality. So
there
it's
is
not
a commitment
complacent.
to keep putting
Absolutely.
resources and keeping it in these areas
Absolutely.
that are identified that this shift is taking place.
We've got to prioritise in that way, and as I say, particularly around the violence, but about all our criminality, that's how we have to operate. We've got to prioritise to where the problem is the greatest, or the need is the greatest, and do what we can do there.
Thank you for that confirmation.
Yeah, can I come to the area of deferred prosecutions? Last Friday, I think there was an indication that you're going to do a pilot. Slightly worried about some of the language that was used in that article. So using the basis of threat, harm, risk, are we very clear within the Met that if someone commits violence, they're not going to get a deferred prosecution? And if they are, in what circumstances would they? So I want to be very clear about this, and would you be consulting with us around the nature of the pilot, or sharing those issues, and how long is the length of pilot and all the issues? So, you know, I think it's a welcome to have a pilot. Don't think there's anything wrong in looking at deferred prosecutions. I think it's called conditional charging, a bit old-fashioned. That's what it used to be called. How is it going to work? But how are we going to reduce violence per se if we have a deferred issue around that? So are we clear about that? Are we unclear about that? Because there can be no mixed messages if you're following the mayoral strategy and you want to drive down violence around these circumstances. I want to stop young people getting on the ladder of crime, but equally, I think society demands that there's some issues here and about managing the risk to others. Who's going to take that?
I mean, that pilot around deferred prosecutions is a result of the Lammy review, and it was a particular recommendation around the Lammy review because I think it's been piloted in the West Midlands and has shown that it has had some effect in terms of tackling disproportionality, especially for young black men in the criminal justice system. We haven't yet worked through all the details of the pilot, but clearly, where there is that risk of violence, there will be thresholds. It won't be for everybody who's stopped and arrested on the streets, but who will be appropriate for deferred prosecution, and absolutely it won't be where there will be a risk of violence. We're working with the Ministry of Justice on that because it's flowing from the Lammy review around tackling disproportionality and how can ensuring if we can get that up and running with the right thresholds and with the safeguards around it, that it isn't for those much more serious offences like knife possession or propensity to violence, that we can do that. And we hope that it will enable us to tackle some of the disproportionality that we're very worried about in the criminal justice system.
Is this just aimed at juveniles, or is it going to go upwards? What's the upper age limit? How long am I going to...
It's early days. I know it was in the papers last week. It's early days, and we did say when we published our response to the Lammy review that we'd be discussing this with the Ministry of Justice, and we are, but it's early days in terms of the details of that. But we can come back to you when that has been settled.
And I really think that it fits with the right parameters, and you would imagine the parameters that I would want to set around it. But I think it really does fit about, if you think about a lot of these particularly younger people who I talked about being drawn in, are being exploited, and they may well have committed some sort of criminal offence, but if there is an opportunity to find a way to divert them from going, because we know what the system is like once you go into the system, it's very hard then, but equally it's a chance to try and find a way to give people an opportunity to not end up down, what is a kind of depressingly predictable route, really. And so I think there's a real opportunity, but as Sophie said, around dangerousness, I cannot see that we would.
It's also about time limits, isn't it?
Yes.
So 12 months would be too short for a deferred prosecution, and how do we monitor that? How long's the pilot going to be in? When do we see what success is? I'm not aware of the West Midlands. I mean, I do welcome the pilot, But equally, I do want to keep the pressure down on driving violence down. And, you know, there are some times when judgment calls have to be made. It'd be quite interesting that the juvenile system, I understand about how those judgment calls will be made. If we're talking about those judgment calls are going to be, you know, I don't want to get into a tick box issue. And how is this going to work for everybody who comes before the police in terms of stopping that life, you know, getting on that life crime cycle in terms of these issues? So it'd be quite interesting to see some of the detail that comes back to you and when it does.
And as I said, the deferred prosecution pilot is not, it's not within this, you know, it's not as a response to the violence on the streets of London and nationwide. It's actually a response to disproportionality, and how can you tackle that? So I just wanted to not merge. But you can see why I'm raising it. Yes, absolutely, and that's why you need.
Too easily, we're letting people onto the streets who have committed multiple violence. It's not just in terms of a police issue, where there has been a cause of multiple violence and they continue to do it. What we want to do is avoid that.
Yep,
and on this issue, I totally agree with you about disproportionality. I can talk about also between rich and poor, who escapes justice in our society and who doesn't. And, you know, this is not just about the middle classes getting through this system because they know how to use it, and the working classes are disproportionately suffered in that way, whether they're black or white, and go through this criminal system. So that's why I'm raising it, because I don't think you can divorce. I understand why it's come about and welcome the pilot, as I've said, but equally I don't think we can divorce it from the wider issues that we're trying to tackle in terms of what's going on our streets.
Yes, thank you. And on that latter subject, perhaps we'll interest ourselves in that further then at a particular time. Now, the last set of questions we got on this subject is around the Mayor's media campaign. We heard from witnesses last time out about the success or otherwise around it. And Susan, you want to ask a question or two?
I'll be as brief as possible because I'm mindful of Assistant Commissioner's time. So the questions actually are to you, Deputy Mayor. How much has the London Needs You Alive campaign cost to date, and what is the overall predicted spend for the life of the campaign?
In terms of the cost of the London Needs You Alive, it was £250,000, and the Mayor has also put aside some extra money to ensure that it continues in the campaign, which is part of the Mayor's Young Londoners Fund. I think that's roughly about £100,000. I'd have to come back to you on that figure for the additional money that's gone into that.
How many?
And of course, sorry, go on.
No, do finish.
Well, it's a social media campaign, so it generates a life of its own. So it's not that we fund it and it lasts as long as we fund it. It has a life of its own as well. It continues, and it will be part of it is social media, but that money is also being spent on developing a toolkit for schools and community groups to use in educating young people and working with young people. And we should be launching that by the end of this month. We are just finalising that toolkit. So it's about the campaign and the messaging, but there is also, there's action and practice underneath it, which has been funded through that money as well.
Okay, you say it's a life of its own, but actually it's not got much of a life from what we can see. It's only had 25,000 views of the video, which, when you look at how many views of videos...
Yeah, that's just wrong, sorry. I'm not sure where that 25,000 figure has come from. It's not correct. The total views of the London Needs You Alive video across social media has been 3.7 million. So it's just wrong. I know that was a figure that was given to you at your evidence session, but it must be a small one of the social media platforms or one place that you can click on that video. It's 3.7 million views.
Okay, fair enough. We'll look into that. Thank you for clarifying that. How many organisations have used the material that you've had available through the campaign?
At the moment, what's out there is the social media messaging around London Needs You Alive. It is being used across London. Some local authorities are using it as part of their own knife crime activity. It is being regenerated. I can't give you the figure in terms of the number of organisations, but it's been retweeted, it's been reused, and those messages are being sent far and wide, as you can see from the fact that it's 3.7 million views on that video as it stands at the moment.
We haven't got sight of that, and we have been told that it's been retweeted 155 times. Well, many of us have had retweets on our Twitter accounts for more than that.
I'm not making the figures up. The number of views.
No, fair enough, but neither am I. So
I think what you're looking at.
I'll just intercede here. I think we would like you to write to us with a breakdown, because our officers have been trying to get some stats around this, sort of unsuccessfully. So I think there's a. I can
give you the stats now, and I can write to you.
I think there's a real disparity around some figures and facts, whether it's YouTube hits or retweets.
I think, to be fair, this is what we were told in evidence a couple of weeks ago.
I know.
I must say, I did find those figures very surprising too.
Yeah, Hackney Quest told you that figure. It is a specific figure, and I can't remember which platform it was. It's a specific figure from views from that platform, rather than looking overall across social media and across all the different platforms from Facebook, Instagram, YouTube.
We'd like those details, but I'll return to Susan to...
Okay, I'm trying to be as speedy as possible. What evidence do you have that the campaign is actually reaching the young people and communities that it is intended for?
Well, it's back to the number of views in terms of the reach it has had. We also know that there's been views by 13 to 17-year-olds. The figure I have is 1.5 video views, 1.5 million video views by 13 to 17-year-olds. We know it's getting through to young people. What we are doing is we are also backing that up, and that's why we have the toolkit, which is about to be launched, with enabling those that are working with young people to link the message on social media to work that they're doing with young people, either in schools, in community groups, but also faith groups. We've been working with educationalists, faith groups and community groups to develop this toolkit. It's nearly ready, and we hope to launch it by the end of June.
Okay, I mean, there isn't one person sitting around this horseshoe that doesn't want this to work, because anything that we can find. But we were concerned at our last meeting when somebody actually said, and it's somebody that works with young people do not see themselves as Londoners. They are very localised. A campaign about London needs you alive about knife crime is almost irrelevant to them. It is not touching the young people. It is totally irrelevant to young people. I would not use it as a youth worker working with young people to talk to them about knife crime. I would use other resources. So clearly, we were concerned about that. We couldn't find how much the whole campaign was costing anywhere. 250k is a lot of money. When you hear comments like that, it is a concern. So what evaluation is being done for you to decide that this is a good method and that going forward with it is a good way of spending this money?
So it concerns me that any youth worker is saying that, but it was based on because I believe that was somebody from Hackney Quest that said that, and it was based on a figure which is, as I've already said, is a very small proportion of the number of times that it has been used and it's been looked at. And in terms of how that campaign was developed, there was extensive research with young people as to what are the best messages. Many other youth workers have said to us, if you want to get a message through to young people, you need to get positive messages and not scaring them or didactic messages, but positive messages. And that's why London Needs You Alive is the campaign that it is. In terms of evaluation going forward, obviously we will keep an eye on views, hits and how many times it's been looked at, but we are very, very, what we'll also be evaluating is number of times in the toolkit, how we can get the toolkit into schools. We are talking to a number of schools at the moment around using the toolkit and encouraging them to use the toolkit. Ultimately, and it will be difficult to prove a direct correlation, what I'm interested in and what the police are in turn, I'm sure we're all interested in, is are we having an effect with all the different ways that we are trying to tackle knife crime? Is it reducing knife crime? And are we bringing down the unacceptable level of murders? London Needs You Alive, I think, is a really good campaign, but it's not the only thing we're doing in order to try to do that. And it will be very difficult to just isolate the London Needs You Alive campaign and its effect, as well as the enforcement, work we're doing with schools, work we're doing with voluntary and community groups, as well as the money that we are putting into the community to community seed funding.
Fair enough. Can you just clarify to us where you get those hit numbers from? And also, can you send us a list of the organisations that have actually asked you for the materials to go ahead with it. And then
Write to us with those.
I can write to you with those figures, and the toolkit is going to be launched, and when we have launched the toolkit, we can give you that information.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief. To you, Deputy Mayor, social media can be misused, but it can also be a very powerful tool as well, and I certainly welcome the London Needs Your Life campaign. So the London Needs Your Life campaign was launched in November 2017, and in March 2018, the Home Office launched its own knife crime campaign costing around £1.35 million. Was there any dialogue between the Home Office and yourself? Did they consult you in any way in terms of the success or lessons to be learned from the London Is Your Life campaign?
The Home Office regularly consults us on what we're doing in London around the whole of our tackling knife crime, as well as consults the Metropolitan Police. In terms of that, and I would say that a lot of what is in the violent crime strategy, the government's violent crime strategy, has been taken from London. There's community seed funding, there was the campaign. These things we were doing already. I had discussions with the Home Office around their campaign. I was suggesting to them that it would be much better to join with our campaign, but they wanted their own campaign. But they do consult us in terms of what we are doing, because we are doing so much and that we are breaking ground on this. They've also taken up the Metropolitan Police's operations sector and asked for that to be rolled out across the country, because it is such an example of good practice.
The conclusion I would draw is that clearly they must believe in the value of the London Is Your Life campaign. Thank you.
Right, now, colleagues, we've got 3 more sets of questions, and with respect to Martin Hewitt, he is leaving soon after 12, so I would ask colleagues to be brief and to almost self-regulate. I know it can be quite tricky. So, the next set of questions is on child protection, and I've got Caroline.
Thank you. First of all, to the Assistant Commissioner, there's been some concerns about supervision of officers in this field. It's something we, several years ago in one of our reports, flagged this huge issue of effective staffing and supervision. And we've recently seen, it's been reported that an officer is suing the Met for psychiatric injury while investigating these appalling crimes. So what is the Met doing to ensure officers working in this very difficult environment are properly supported?
Okay, so I mean, at the first level, there's a whole programme of work around health and well-being, and particularly health and mental well-being for all of our staff, because this is one particular aspect, but there are a whole range of issues which I think, from a mental health point of view, are really challenging. In this particular area, I think you end up with 2 groups. You've got those that are doing this, if you like, as a full-time role. So we have people in one of our commands, what we call SCO 40, which is the one that looks specifically at online child abuse. And then you also have our child abuse and sexual offences command, where they would routinely be coming into contact with such material. So for both of those teams, they are obviously checked when they become part of the team. They provide questionnaires so that we're monitoring where they are, and they also get a minimum of once every 12 months with a psychologist, so they are actually spoken to over that period. A clinical psychologist will meet with them. For those people that are working in the very extreme end, that could be much more frequent. And then on the back of that, they are in the position to obviously seek a further kind of clinical intervention to support them. Where the real challenge has come around this, and it still remains something of a challenge, is the sheer explosion in numbers, as you would understand, of this type of crime. And I think what's happened over the last few years simultaneously is, firstly, because of the growth of the internet and the various platforms, the ability for people to produce, spread and share this kind of material has gone up massively. And then law enforcement's capability to actually identify and spot that has gone up massively. So you've got a very, very significant growth, and the kind of figures that people will quote is sort of year on year 80% increases in the number of these that are coming in. One of the things that has meant is for offences that are deemed to be at a lower level, they would be going out to local units, to CID units. And that's the area where I think we're working really hard to try and identify how we can, because clearly that spread of people, so you are able to manage it so that the same people are not getting this routinely. They have to go and view in a particular facility. In that facility, there will always be supervision, that part of which is caring for their welfare. There is lots of information there about the access to occupational health. But we are working up, and there's a proposal that will come to management board at some point in the not too distant future about where do we go with this, because it is growing continually. And as you say, we are getting examples where officers are clearly finding this quite difficult to do. So it's an area where there are a range of challenges. I think at the full-time end, we have a pretty good service. Where we have to get better is how we look after those people where this would not be what they're doing as a job, so to speak.
That sounds good, what you're looking to develop. Is there any monitoring to guarantee that the officers who are doing this day in, day out are getting this psychologist appointment once every 12 months? And for those in the harder end, you said it can be more often. Should you be looking to make that mandatory?
And that is precisely what happens through the line management processes there. I mean, we are very alive to the impact that it has. And those people that are working in the kind of dark web environment, I mean, is quite frankly a horrific environment to be operating in. And so they would be getting much more frequent. It is a significant role for all supervisors in those and managers in those departments to constantly be monitoring the health and well-being of our people. And there is a fact, we are all different, and some people are able to, we will all have a tolerance level. So it's really about line management and looking after the staff and being alive to this. The challenge for us is where we go with the much broader, as these things just exponentially seem to grow in terms of what comes into us.
Okay, thank you. I know Andrew wants to come in.
Yeah, if I could. We're looking at the issue of indecent images of children. 2 or 3 points. I understand there's only one place in the Met where the viewing of this goes on, at the Empress Building.
Yeah.
Following on the points you've just been making to Caroline, my understanding is that getting help for staff is primarily on the basis of self-referral rather than anything else. And the third point I wanted to raise are the delays in actually processing this material to a stage where you can either prosecute or not. And apparently it's months and months and months. Through the forensic side of it. So perhaps you'd like to comment on those three points.
So if I can remember the three. Right, yes, at the moment it is one place, and we are looking at whether you do more. There are advantages to one place in terms of the way that you can control that environment and do the things you need to do, but we are looking at whether, and again, as I say, this paper that's going to come through will make suggestions about that. The second point was around
referral of staff.
As I've just said in answer to the previous question, there is a supervisory responsibility around this. But this issue of helping people is one that is really very prominent for us at the moment, not only in relation to this issue, but also in relation to the events of last year and some of the things that people did and saw there. And certainly one of my reflections is how you want to be helped and how you need to be helped are very personal and individual things. People that are doing the same job or were at the same event, one person, and we spend a lot of time talking to officers who've been involved in all of this. Some people will say, well, stop offering me this, I don't want this to be, and others will say, why am I having to go? And this will be, so it's a very much individual thing that we've got to manage in the way that we supervise people. We have a very clear occupational health process and department, and as I say, for those people in those teams, it is a mandatory requirement anyway to be going through the regular, depending on the length.
I think the fire service is actually doing this rather better in terms of when people are exposed to particularly horrific things. They maybe like to look at how they approach supporting their staff. And don't just mean big events like Grenfell, where it's a major operation, but more generally. And I think compared to what you've just said, compared to what they're doing, I think it might be something you could learn from.
We can certainly look at, I mean, I know in our occupational health work, we work with a whole range of other organisations where you have people in similar, so the military, the other emergency services, all of those services are facing the same challenge of how you deal with people who are facing traumatic issues.
Well, I'll say the fire service.
Yeah, well, we can certainly have a look.
They did have a step change 30 years ago after the King's Crossfire, and it's been much more proactive in relation to it. And the third point was the length of delays in terms of examining the material forensically, so you can actually bring a prosecution. And apparently the delays, I've been told, are months and months and months.
There are significant delays. So partly that is as a result of, as I say, the exponential growth in the number of things that are being referred to us. So if I just take an example from the referrals that we will get from the National Crime Agency, from the child exploitation element within the National Crime Agency. In 2016 we had 1,000, I beg your pardon, in 2016 it was 400 referrals. In 2017 it was 1,000 referrals, and the anticipation this year it will be 2,500 referrals. So these are growing enormously, and there is a funnel point with the technology, with actually being able to do the downloading. So there is a delay at the moment. Obviously we will triage the things that are coming in to try and best understand. But again, one of the challenges that you face is often the number of devices, particularly when we start the investigations, the number of devices that you then are having to deal with is significant, as it is with all our investigation, you know, and that links you into the sort of disclosure issue. So there is a delay. As I say, there is a paper coming forward to the board about how we seek to deal with that, but we are, you know, you are down to making prioritisation decisions around resourcing.
Am I right in saying the delays are months and months and months?
Yeah, they can be. In some cases, there will be, yeah. It's significant. I'm not, you know, and I don't seek to underplay it, but I think we have just got to start from the position of just the sheer level to which this is growing year on year, and there is only, you know, there is a funnel point when it comes in, and when we have to then do all the various downloading and assessing.
How long do you think it will be before you can get on top of this? And
as I say, I don't know the detail of that paper, so I'm not going to kind of pretend that there's what I know is coming. So we need to get that paper, we need to assess that at the board, and then we need to clearly see, because as with all things, to speed things up, you are talking about now more technology is easier to do, more people is less easy to do, and we will have to balance those priorities. But it is something, again, it's not something purely for the Met. It's something for the service wide and for the NCA for that matter, which has just grown and grown and grown at a rate that I don't think anyone could be expected to keep up with, but we need to find a way of how we go through this. And certainly, I think at a national level, you know, the national lead around child abuse, Chief Constable Simon Bailey, you know, has been out and is having lots of talking about how we find a way collectively as a system to deal with what is something that quite clearly on demand alone you're never going to be able to deal with in a simple way.
Well, perhaps you could update us in writing when you've got a...
Sorry, I beg your pardon?
Perhaps you can update us in writing.
Yes, of course, yeah, of course we will, yeah.
When you get back to the shop.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to...
So just it's on that
sorry,
it's related just before she moves off onto the other issues. Oh no, you could follow this. Sorry, Caroline. Sorry, I'll follow on after. Sorry, apologies.
Okay, I want to pick up the issue of children in care going missing, 17,000 in 2017. This is a huge concern, very vulnerable children. What are you doing to ensure all agencies are playing their part in reducing the number of children going missing from care? And what is your role in this?
So first off, we're doing an enormous amount in terms of not just children, but missing, people going missing. And as you say, the figure in 2017 for those in care was just under 17,000. The total number of missing reports that we took during that year was 55,189, which is a very significant number. But in the youngsters, the numbers there are particularly significant. So in the 0 to 12 age range in that year was 2,454, and then in the 13 to 18 age range was 32,811. So it is a significant number of children, and a proportion of which are in care. We work really closely with all the premises that provide, and all the social services departments that provide care for children in London. As you will be aware, often the children that are in a particular area are not from that particular area. We get quite a few who come from counties outside London and are lodged in homes in London, and you have quite a number of private homes which are which are in the city. So we work at a local level very closely with all of those homes. It's about establishing a relationship, and often through the neighbourhood officers will be the ones that will establish a relationship. But we also have a missing unit on every one of our BCUs that will coordinate the activity, and we have a missing persons coordinator on each of the units. A large part of what we do for youngsters, and then ironically, if you look at the thing that's called the Herbert Protocol around the elderly who are in care homes for elderly, we basically produce what I would probably call trigger plans, so that we have as much information already documented about those individuals. So in the youngsters, it will be obviously all the details about who they are, where they're from, who they may be going back to, where they've gone when they've gone missing before, any particular vulnerabilities they may have, and so on, which is the responsibility of the home to put together. And we do likewise with elderly people who may have dementia, Alzheimer's, or other factors that may cause them to go. That means then when someone goes missing, we would instantly prioritise them, and then you've got that pack that allows you to start doing what you do to try and find them. We work really hard with the homes.
Most children are in foster homes. They're not in
the
bigger care homes. Most people are dispersed.
So clearly we can't do that in that situation.
The majority of children in care, there's very few homes these days.
There are quite a few across London that we've worked with the Children's Commissioner and other groups around how we manage that as best we can. But the reality is we will deal with them as we will deal with other juvenile mispers. We will clearly be looking at what particular vulnerability factors exist, and often those vulnerability factors will be around exploitation for being involved in criminality in the kind of county lines way we've described. There is, I would say, a very significant number of the particularly female juveniles who are at risk of child sexual exploitation as a vulnerability factor. That would all make them a high-risk missing person straight away, which will then allow us to do what we do. Our role is to find those children. We do get involved to some extent with the kind of return interviews. I think that's an area where we're pushing really hard to get other agencies and other parties, because the reality is, however good one of my officers is, when a young male police officer is catching hold of a young juvenile misper at 1 o'clock in the morning, the chances of that girl actually disclosing why they're away, what the issues are, is almost zero, I think. And I think where we've got to get to is find ways to understand, well, what is the root cause of why this child is repeatedly going away from where they're supposed to be. And then you start to be able to get into understanding what the other issues are, because where that is exploitation, we need to be dealing with that criminality as well, and not seeing this as the one-off kind of incident.
So what specific work are you doing with agencies to reduce the number of children missing in care?
To say, the specific work is working with all those places where we can go, where we know we have the children in care, so the homes. We clearly can't go to every foster home because we wouldn't necessarily know where they are. We work very closely with children's services and the other agencies that have a responsibility around the children. Our missing people coordinators who work on each of the BCUs will obviously develop those relationships, and we'll do the follow-up around trying to understand. And we will get significant numbers of repeat mispers. I mean, some of them are shocking, the numbers of repeat missing people. But ultimately, our responsibility is to try and find them. But where I think collectively everyone needs to get to is, what is it that is making that young person so frequently go away from where they are supposed to be? And that's where we work with all those with the other groups and the other agencies to try and understand that.
But there is a specific program at the moment trying to.
There's no. It happens. It will happen on every BCU. There's not a specific program that I am aware of. We have a lead under our safeguarding banner. We have a lead responsible person who oversees all issues around missing. So we are constantly looking for where there is good practice, where there are things that people are doing that we think can work with us. We are talking to all those other agencies that support young people. As I say, working with the children, because the Children's Commissioner has produced a number of reports which talk about this in great depth, and we go and we are involved in all the kind of events that they do. But fundamentally, most of this is happening as individuals. But where we can follow up with schools, with our schools officers. So it's really, once you've identified a young person, whether they're in care or not in care, as a regular MISPER. It's about how you wrap around all the opportunities to try. But I know I keep repeating it, but the frustration for me, because these numbers have just been going up and going up. You know, if you go back to, I didn't do the maths on all of the years, but if you go back to 2014 and compare that to 17, in 2014, there were over the total number of missing people was 46, just over 46,000. So that was 9,000 less of those, and it was only 13,500 looked after children. So this is growing, and you know, fundamentally where we've, you know, collectively got to try and get to is understanding why they're doing this, because we spend our time chasing after them, and you almost know, the officers know, we'll put them back, and we know tomorrow night they're going to be off again, which is, you know, it's using a lot of our resource, but that's not really the point here. It's about these young people, because they're vulnerable.
What work are you doing with frontline officers? There was a quote in one of the HMI inspections where about children going missing from care, and the officer said, well, that's just what they do, which is probably not the attitude you'd want from an officer who's picking up a vulnerable young person, taking them back to their home. It's not the sort of supportive attitude you'd want. What are you doing to change that sort of attitude on the front line? So
there's been an enormous amount done since that inspection. What I would say about that comment, I, having been there, you know, 100 years ago, I recognise that frustration that when an officer knows almost, if we're on you know, night duty for these 5 days, we're going to 4 times we're going to go back to that same place because Johnny's run off again. So I get that frustration. But what we've done is that there's been an enormous campaign that we've run in terms of awareness and changing the culture called Spot It, Stop It, around child abuse in its broadest sense, but majoring on MISPERS. And that, I think, is starting to show a really significant impact. And I think HMI are now recognising that that is starting to show a significant impact. There's been training given to all frontline officers. They're using the missing coordinators. So I think it's all been about that, raising the... And the phrase that I always use, because it was kind of thrown back and it really made me think at a time when it previously doing something else, is about you've got to see the child. The reality is some of these 14-year-olds are incredibly difficult and challenging and aggressive and angry young people for a whole range of reasons, but you've got to get past that and see that that is still a 14-year-old child, and that's really what we are, and we've been working really hard. And you know, the HMI are going to be coming back at the end of the year to do a re-inspection around that, and I am hopeful and confident really that they will be able to demonstrate that change in that kind of approach. But even with an officer making that kind of comment, that doesn't equally necessarily mean that they will not be doing what they need to do. And, you know, because I don't accept that we've got loads of officers who are horrible to loads of kids that they're chasing around. That's not the case. Are they frustrated by it? I suspect sometimes they are, but that's not the same thing, because fundamentally, in the vast, vast, vast majority of cases, our people really care, and these youngsters are incredibly vulnerable. However angry and shouty they might be, they're very vulnerable.
Thank you. And then to the Deputy Mayor, the most recent HMI report showed that 90% of the cases it examined were judged still to be requiring improvement or inadequate. Really astonishing to still be in that place. We're told it was summer this 2018 rather than the end of the year that HMI are coming back. I wonder perhaps, Deputy Mayor, if you can give us an update, because I know you've been keeping a close eye on this, and what your assessment is of the current frontline response to child protection.
You're right, HMIC are coming back in August
and October.
August and October, yeah, we're expecting them back. I mean, I think you asked me this last time in terms of, I think there's, well, I know there has been considerable effort and energy and leadership around improving, and there's been training. What I'm frustrated at, and I know it is just taking too long for that to show itself in the outcomes. And that is I'm still concerned that that is the case. We do, you know, I chair a 6-weekly oversight group, which we met on Monday actually, and we went through the issues that you've asked Martin about in terms of welfare of officers there as well. I am concerned that the rate of progress is still too slow, and that's what HMIC will find. I don't think that will be a surprise to us. What we are doing is looking at how can you progress that further. I'm frustrated by that. It isn't fast enough, and as I said to you before, it's something that I am absolutely keeping an eye on. Not just keeping an eye on, I have that oversight group that I chair, and we go through those performance measurements. We look at missing persons. We look at the outcomes from the case reviews. It's slowly changing, but not fast enough.
Can you give me some examples of what practical things you are doing to try to accelerate this change?
Well, it's the practical things that are being done by the Metropolitan Police, because it's
but you're pushing them. So what?
In terms of one of the issues was around police custody, young people in police custody. We have a local authority representative on the group. We have ensured, and these figures have improved, that the custody sergeants, the detention officers, are asking local authorities now for alternative accommodation. It's not been provided for a number of reasons. That's still an issue, but we know that through the oversight group, but also through the driving that Martin has put through the system, that is changing, that is properly happening now. There has also been work around missing persons, the Stop It to the campaign as part of the work that has been in terms of trying to change the culture and really trying to change the level of understanding, the level of officers looking out for child protection and issues around vulnerability. I mean, those are 3 examples of specifics that have been through oversight, but also through the work that Martin and Commander Richard Smith have been driving through the Metropolitan Police. I am still worried by it. I am still concerned. It is taking a long time.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we will be returning to this. Thank you.
Do you want to come in?
2 very quick questions. It relates to the transition to the 12 basic command units. Now, of course, it's not a bolt-on, it's a new way of working, albeit I think there's mixed messages coming out of the Met on the implementation. What do you think can we expect in terms of that organisational change to be on the improved outcomes of child protection cases? Are we aiming to be ambitious, or is it more of the same?
No, I think we are aiming to be ambitious to improve the way that not just child protection but the whole of the safeguarding arena works, and the way that the modelling works for the BCUs is to bring together into that safeguarding hub where you would have what we would have previously had in community safety units around some of the domestic abuse and those kind of issues, the rape investigations and the child investigations. So, and I think that what we have seen in the 2 that have been live for some time is encouraging around the safeguarding, and I would make the point that both Camden and Islington both had Ofsted inspections which came back really well around child protection. Both were good inspections, and we are now in the process, as you will know, the second 2 BCUs of one's gone live and one will go live in a week or so. So there is an ambition to bring together the officers that are working in this arena, because often the vulnerabilities cross over. You don't just have domestic abuse over here and child abuse over here and sexual offending here. So it's about bringing that together, giving us the best possibility to deal with the overall vulnerability factors as well as we possibly can, and providing a much more coherent relationship out with the other agencies and organisations that we work with.
And so the Met has done some comparisons between the old structure and the new structure, and we're quite confident that it's
that is what we are doing.
And is that available to us? Is there a report done on that? It could be in the wider community safety, whatever we call it, arena that you're doing. Is there some commentary or narrative around that performance, around from pilots or others that have been part of the transition?
I think we will be able to, because where we do that, obviously we're monitoring internally how things are working. It gets monitored. I have a monthly meeting with Deputy Mayor around where we are with the BCUs and that whole question of how do we assess whether they are working in the way that we wanted them to work. And in fact, on this week's oversight meeting around child protection, one of the questions that was specifically asked for the data by Sophie was, are we seeing the improvements we would have expected to see in the BCUs that have gone live?
And do we go back to my original opening statement, being provocative if I am on this issue? So is the attitude or the cultural issues, I think we heard a little bit of earlier that from Caroline Pidgeon, there about that this is a new way of working and a higher expectation of what's been achieved in the past. Is that really rooted in all these units that are going to be established and those willing to learn off others before they before the transition?
Yes, is the answer. I think there has been a significant shift in terms of where we want the organisation to be around safeguarding as a whole, and I think that will get demonstrated when HMI come back. But that is fundamentally part of what we're doing with the BCUs, and the ones that are coming online are all learning all the time from the ones that have gone ahead. And those 12 people who are in charge of the BCUs, plus the 12 people who are the safeguarding superintendents, are all working constantly to try and make sure that we can, because we will learn as we go through with everyone, we will learn, things will be identified, and that's one of the reasons why I think the model is better, because we will have very clearly in each one of those 12 there will be one superintendent whose responsibility is the safeguarding element within his or her BCU. So not only will they work within their own team, but they will also collectively be the team of those that undertake safeguarding, and they will work to Richard Smith, who's the commander, whose full-time job is around safeguarding. So I really do think there is an ambition and there is a commitment, but the change is not as fast as we would want it to be. But in my defence, and I think everyone else's defence, we have always said you're not going to spin that around overnight. That's going to take time, but I think all the building blocks are there for us to get much better in terms of the way those investigations are undertaken. And I do, and I said this when I came and spoke about the child protection inspection, that is an inspection against the list of this is how it ought to be done and what you ought to do, and that is valid entirely. But it's not equally, therefore, that in all cases where there's requires improvement, there was an unsafeguarded child, or there was we've got to be realistic about it. We need to get to the point where we absolutely haven't got any that are inadequate. There should never be any of those investigations that are inadequate. There will always be some that require improvement, and that's about learning. And I've probably never done an investigation that was perfect. There's always improvement, and I think we just need to. But it's the fundamental one is: are we safeguarding? And particularly in any investigation, whether it's a misper or a child abuse, are we identifying where there is a real immediate risk now, and are we acting on that? And that's
once we accept there is going to be an element of improving, the issues are it's too high at the moment of what needs to be improving, isn't it? And what is the acceptable level that you think post this review that you what as you go into this review, what would you like? But actually, it will take a little bit longer to achieve.
Well, we have this discussion, and that is the question that the Deputy Mayor asks me frequently to identify, and it is difficult. But the key one that and as we said this on Monday, absolutely there should be zero that are inadequate, because I think inadequate now requires improvement could be a range of. There's a lot that needs improving, or there's one or two bits that could be improved. I would say, we should be aiming for at least 50% should be good and perfectly, acceptable. We should have zero at requires improvement, and I think we've constantly got to strive, or zero and inadequate, I beg your pardon. We should be constantly striving to reduce the numbers that are around requires improvement. But I'm loath to put an exact figure because I don't want. It's about us.
Yeah, we've already had a little conversation.
I'm sure you have.
We think we've got a figure.
2017 suggests that the percentage of suspects on police bail dropped from 35% to 6%. What's not clear to me is that 6% after the 28 days, or is that from de novo?
Yes.
And is the drop from 35% to 6% because it's actually doing the trick and people are getting charged more quickly, or is it because the investigation is still going on, you're just having to release people as though they were under investigation without conditionality on their release? And the sub-point about letting people out under investigation with no conditions is what effect does that have on public safety, particularly if it's people who are accused of violent crime?
Yeah. So what I would say, the figure that we are running at the moment. So first off, there has been a significant impact on the use of police bail as a result of the legislative change, but arguably that was their intention. The figure that we're running at the moment is 8% of people will be put out with bail by us at the police station, which is higher than probably most other places around the country. Most other places are lower than that. Important point though, of that those that are bailed, 90% of those will go out with conditions on their bail. So they will go out with a condition on their bail. As you would imagine, that figure is weighted to the more serious And so serious offending or dangerous offending, where we would be in a position to seek bail. But as you will be aware, you know, the concept of the legislation was to reduce the number of people that went out on bail, and essentially against the kind of the headings that are there around, you know, them not fleeing and so on, we have to prove to get the bail secured that that not only there would be a problem against one of those criteria, but also that by bailing them you would solve that problem. So it's been quite a tight bar. I think both in London, where we've done a lot of work and we've got a whole action plan around how we make sure that we're monitoring this and it's not turning out to be something that we don't want to happen, but also nationally there is a plan around from the police service, because in some places the level got very, very small indeed. So we are very weighted towards more serious offending, so more serious offending or anyone that's dangerous. The other opportunity is to try and get people dealt with in court in the first instance, just deal with it in one go. And if I have got...
Well, that's the point. The effect is it resulting in charges more quickly?
So if we look at... so for serious violence offences, 52% of those are dealt with in custody. So 52 that were dealt with there, and they go forward. And then with just talking about possession offences around the drugs, it's 55% again, same again. But you'll be able, you know, and it's about how we absolutely make use of the bail time or the custody time that we've got. But again, although that 8% figure is the overarching figure for the number of people that are bailed, if you take serious violence, it's 17% of people are bailed to return. So that would be added to the 52% that we would deal with in that first instance. For possession of a bladed article, 7% of those bailed. So possession of them, 7%, but that would be against 55% that we're actually dealing with. So the ambition is to try and deal with people in that instance. If you can't deal with them, you've got to see whether you need the bail, and the bail is weighted, as I say, very heavily towards those offences where there is dangerousness or ongoing risk or so on, and then obviously we'd then get the bail. And as I say, those that we are bailing, 90% of them go out with conditions on that bail.
And I think it's on with the last question. How often do you apply for extensions of police bail? Because the superintendent can give you up to 3 months, and the magistrates presumably indefinitely.
Rolling 3 months, yeah.
So how often are you actually using that facility?
I will find you that number. I don't know the answer to that. I think my thought is that in terms of the magistrates, I think it is relatively limited, but certainly superintendent bails are taking place. But we'll get those figures and we can provide those figures for you.
I suppose that the key question is, on one hand, balancing the human rights of people not to be kept dangling for a long time. The other side is protection of the public. And are you satisfied that the way it's operating now provides sufficient protection for the victims of crime, particularly those in violent offenders who may go out for retribution?
I mean, that's what we would be aiming for, and that's why the figures for the bail there are as high as they are, or higher in those, and as I say, with the conditions, because that's the really key bit as well. You know, bailing someone out is bailing someone out, but you need to bail them out with meaningful conditions that give us a degree of control. But certainly we would not be aiming to let somebody out who we thought there was a danger, or they were a kind of ongoing risk, without being able to put whatever conditions. And ideally we would want them in court the next morning, quite frankly.
Has custody gone up as well?
Custody?
The potential of suspects held in custody gone up?
As in that we are arresting, or?
Yeah, well, arresting then processing in court.
Oh, I see. I mean, the number of people that are ultimately getting locked up for violence offences has gone up, but in terms of the overall number, in terms of the number we're putting into court, I don't have that figure.
Now, that is a subject we will return to, because your point about people being released that could be seeking retribution.
Absolutely right. It's a cause of concern to us as well, and I think, as you said, we did make quite a lot of representation collectively as a service in advance.
Okay. Again, can I thank guests for attending today? Can I thank members also for their respect for Martin, so we can go early? Can I ask the committee to note the monthly report and answers given by the Deputy Mayor and Metropolitan Police? Item 6, can I ask committee to note the work programme and agree to our meeting slot the 20th of June for a site visit, which we discussed in the pre-meet. Date of next meeting is the 4th of July, when we have the Commissioner here. I have any other business. Thank you very much, colleagues.
Thank you.
I know, exactly.
GLA, chamber, sound. 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 GLA, chamber, sound.